The summer sun of June 28, 1914, rose over Sarajevo like any other day, but the air was restless and thick with unease. The streets bustled with a strange energy, as if the city itself sensed that history's breath was about to roar through its narrow alleys and cobblestone squares. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, rode in a motorcade with his wife Sophie. Their open-topped car gleamed in the morning light, a symbol of empire and authority. The Archduke sat tall, his chest puffed with a mix of pride and stubborn defiance. He was not loved by everyone, even within his own empire, but he was determined to show his strength in Bosnia, a territory simmering with nationalist fury. The streets were lined with curious onlookers. Children waved small flags, women leaned out of windows with kerchiefs fluttering in their hands, men stood shoulder to shoulder muttering about the empire's presence. But behind the crowd, in the shadows, danger stirred. 7 young men, members of the radical nationalist group known as the Black Hand, were scattered along the route. They were barely more than boys, each carrying the heavy burden of a cause that burned hotter than their fear. Their plan was desperate: kill the Archduke and strike a blow for Serbia, for independence, for the dream of breaking free from Austro-Hungarian rule. One of them, Gavrilo Princip, was slight, almost fragile, with dark eyes that seemed older than his years. His hands trembled as he adjusted the pistol hidden beneath his jacket. He was no hardened killer, just a student swept into a storm of ideology and rage. Another conspirator clutched a grenade, his palms slick with sweat. Around them, life moved on. Shopkeepers shouted prices, horses clattered over stones, the bells of the city tolled. None of the ordinary people knew they stood on the edge of a moment that would rip the world open. As the Archduke's car approached the Latin Bridge, the first attacker stepped forward. His heart hammered against his ribs as he pulled the pin from his grenade and hurled it toward the open car. For a second, time seemed to stop. The grenade sailed through the air, straight past the Archduke's vehicle, and exploded beneath the car behind him. A deafening blast shattered glass, shredded metal, and hurled soldiers into the street. Screams erupted, smoke filled the air, and blood spattered the cobblestones. The Archduke's driver, wide-eyed with terror, slammed the accelerator, swerving wildly. Franz Ferdinand stood tall even amid the chaos, his face red with fury. Sophie clutched his arm, trying to calm him. The crowd erupted into a frenzy. People ran in every direction, panicked voices echoing against stone walls. Police officers wrestled the would-be assassin to the ground as he tried to swallow cyanide, only to vomit violently from the poor quality of the poison. But the Archduke was alive. By fate, chance, or incompetence, the attempt had failed. Inside Sarajevo's town hall, the Archduke addressed shaken officials with fire in his voice. "I come to your city, and bombs are thrown at me. This is outrageous." His wife laid a hand gently on his arm, trying to soothe him. The mayor stammered apologies, but Franz Ferdinand's pride was wounded. Against the advice of his security, he insisted on continuing the day's program. He wanted to visit the hospital to see the injured from the morning attack. It was a fatal decision. The driver received instructions but confusion reigned. Streets were blocked, directions were unclear, and in the swirl of chaos, the Archduke's car took a wrong turn straight into history's waiting jaws. On a quiet street, just as the car slowed to reverse, Gavrilo Princip stood at a cafe, devastated that the earlier attempt had failed. He could not have planned what happened next. The Archduke's vehicle stopped right in front of him, so close he could see the Archduke's medals glint in the light, so close he could see Sophie's pale face framed by her hat. Princip's hand moved before his mind could catch up. He drew his pistol. The world narrowed into a tunnel of noise and heartbeat. 2 shots rang out. The first bullet struck Sophie in the abdomen. She gasped, her gloved hand clutching her stomach, blood seeping through silk. The second bullet hit Franz Ferdinand in the neck. "No, Sophie, don't die," the Archduke choked, his voice gurgling with blood. "Stay alive, for our children." But within minutes, both lay slumped in the car, lifeless. The crowd screamed, soldiers seized Princip, dragging him away as he shouted for freedom, his face pale but resolute. He was beaten nearly to death by the mob before police dragged him off. News of the assassination spread like lightning across Europe. Telegraph wires buzzed, newspapers ran urgent headlines, and in the palaces of kings and emperors, the machinery of war began to stir. In Vienna, the Austro-Hungarian Emperor Franz Joseph sat grim and silent, his eyes heavy with sorrow but also with calculation. His advisers whispered of revenge, of crushing Serbia, of showing strength. In Serbia, officials denied involvement but celebrated quietly in the streets. Nationalist fervor burned bright, but fear crept in. Austria-Hungary would not let this go. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II smirked with reckless arrogance, promising his full support to Austria-Hungary in whatever course it chose. The famous blank check was signed, sealing the bond between allies. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas II paced anxiously, torn between protecting Serbia as a Slavic brother and the dread of plunging into a war his empire could barely afford. In Paris and London, diplomats scribbled furiously, their minds racing with possibilities and consequences. The shots in Sarajevo had set fire to the fuse of a powder keg built over decades. For the people of Sarajevo, the day ended in chaos, with soldiers flooding the streets, arrests made by the dozen, and fear gripping the city. Mothers pulled their children inside, men locked the doors, whispers of retribution echoing in the night. But beyond Sarajevo, a darker tide was already rising. Alliances would drag nation after nation into conflict. Pride, revenge, and nationalism would drown out reason. The Archduke's body was carried back to Vienna, draped in black, his empire mourning him with cold ceremony. Sophie, his beloved wife, who had been forbidden from royal honors in life, now lay beside him in death. The world was trembling, but still blind to the storm it was walking into. The assassination in Sarajevo was just the spark. The fire it unleashed would rage across continents, consume empires, and bury millions. Answer, with 2 bullets on a quiet Sarajevo street, the stage was set for the greatest war humanity had ever known. The news of Sarajevo did not merely travel, it thundered across Europe like a cannon shot, shaking palaces, parliaments, and barracks with the force of prophecy. Franz Ferdinand's blood was not yet dry when Vienna hardened its heart. In smoke-filled offices, generals and ministers bent over maps, whispering revenge like priests chanting a liturgy. Serbia would pay, they vowed, not with apologies, not with diplomacy, but with submission and humiliation. Letters were drafted, ultimatums sharpened, demands piled one upon another until no nation could have accepted them without surrendering its dignity. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm leaned over his desk, mustache twitching, pen scratching across the paper that would become known as the blank check. Germany's pledge was absolute. Austria would have their sword at their back. The Kaiser smiled to himself, relishing the idea of flexing the empire's might, confident that the world would tremble at German steel. He dismissed caution, dismissed the possibility that Russia might rise, or that France might stir, or that Britain might awaken from its island detachment. To him, war was a test of nerves, and he believed his enemies would blink first. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas II read the reports with weary eyes. He was a man of fragile conviction, torn between loyalty to his cousin Kaiser Wilhelm and the ancient duty to protect Serbia, the fellow Slavs crying out beneath Austria's threat. Around him, hawks in uniform urged mobilization, the great machine of the Russian Empire rumbling to life. In palaces and smoky taverns, the Russian people whispered of honor, of vengeance, of destiny. The Tsar, cornered by history, raised his pen and signed the order. Mobilization. Trains would soon fill with men in grey coats, bound for a frontier already bristling with fear. Paris vibrated with unease. France, still haunted by the humiliation of losing Alsace and Lorraine decades earlier, saw in Germany's movements the specter of another invasion. The French general staff sharpened plans long prepared, maps inked with red lines where armies would march. Crowds gathered in boulevards, waving tricolors, singing the Marseillaise, voices trembling with both pride and dread. In every household, sons kissed mothers goodbye, lovers embraced on the steps of railway stations, and promises were made to return victorious, though few would ever come back at all. In London, hesitation reigned. Britain had no immediate reason to fight, no Archduke to revenge, no border threatened. But the Foreign Office watched with growing alarm as telegrams multiplied and German ambitions grew clearer. The government wavered until Germany's plan betrayed itself. The Schlieffen Plan, cold in its efficiency, ordered German armies to sweep through neutral Belgium like a scythe, striking France from behind. Britain, bound by treaties and outraged at the violation of neutrality, could no longer remain a spectator. When the lamps of London flickered that night, Foreign Secretary Edward Grey looked out at the twilight and whispered, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." The great powers moved like giants across the board, each step an earthquake, each decision sealing the fate of millions. Declarations of war thundered in rapid succession: Austria against Serbia, Germany against Russia, Germany against France, Britain against Germany. The chain of alliances, meant to preserve peace, now dragged one nation after another into the abyss. Europe was not falling into war, it was marching, drums pounding, banners raised, with a terrible and eager certainty. In Vienna, soldiers kissed the hands of weeping mothers before boarding trains. Young men sang patriotic songs, their voices sharp with excitement, convinced the war would be short, glorious, decided in weeks. They had no idea that mud, rats, and artillery would soon be their companions. In Berlin, crowds filled Unter den Linden, cheering the Kaiser as he stood on his balcony, hand raised, promising triumph. University students in crisp uniforms threw flowers to young women, who waved back with tearful smiles. The city roared with pride, blind to the ruin that would soon stain its streets. In St. Petersburg, priests blessed regiments as they marched, icons raised high, incense filling the air with smoke. The Tsar's portrait was carried at the head of columns, peasants bowed as if watching a holy procession. The soldiers were poor, many barefoot, their rifles outdated, but their hearts burned with zeal. They believed they were marching to defend their brothers, to protect Serbia, to uphold honor. They did not yet know the endless steppes of their homeland would soon swallow their bodies by the tens of thousands. In Paris, war fever mingled with dread. Posters called men to arms, cafes buzzed with arguments, artists, students, bakers, and bankers all swept into the tide. A boy of 17 lied about his age to enlist, a girl of 19 whispered her love into a soldier's ear before he boarded a train, promising to wait forever. Fathers tried to smile bravely as their sons marched away, hiding tears in the shadows of doorways. France was aflame with patriotism, but beneath it smoldered the memory of graves unhealed from the last war with Germany. And in Britain, the island nation roused itself with quiet determination. Volunteers lined up outside recruitment offices, queues stretching around corners, men eager to prove themselves before the war was over, for surely it could not last. Boys too young lied, men too old begged for a chance, fathers enlisted alongside sons. Posters of Lord Kitchener pointed accusingly, his stern eyes commanding, "Your country needs you." London pulsed with resolve, ships stirred in harbors, the empire across the seas now a weapon ready to be wielded. Trains became the arteries of war. Across Europe, locomotives thundered through the night, carriages packed with soldiers singing, shouting, waving from windows as if leaving for a grand festival. Rifles rattled against wooden floors, boots stamped in unison, spirits high. At stations, lovers clung desperately, children reached up with small hands, parents whispered final blessings. Steam hissed, whistles screamed, and the trains departed, carrying men not to parades but to slaughter. Factories lit up with furious industry. Cannons rolled off assembly lines, bullets poured from machines, uniforms stitched by the thousands, gas masks designed in secret. The war economy roared awake, every rivet and every seam a promise of destruction. Women filled the workshops, their hands stained with oil and fabric dye, their faces set with grim pride. Across every nation, society reshaped itself into an engine of war. Yet even as the giants marched, there were voices of doubt. In the cafes of Vienna, a poet whispered that the world was sleepwalking to its grave. In the back rooms of Berlin, a scholar warned that a modern war would consume not just soldiers but whole populations. In the slums of Paris, a mother clutched her children, knowing hunger and sorrow were coming. But those voices were drowned beneath the thunder of drums and the roar of crowds. By August 1914, Europe was no longer a continent of nations, it was a powder keg fully lit. Austria moved against Serbia, Germany surged toward France, Russia mobilized millions, Britain crossed the Channel with the first of its expeditionary force. The age of empires was ready to clash, their banners shining, their armies vast, their ambitions unchecked. And somewhere in the heart of it all, beneath the cheers and the fanfare, lay a silence, a pause before the storm. The soldiers marched believing they would be home by Christmas. They laughed, they sang, they kissed their sweethearts goodbye. They did not know that 4 years of hell awaited them, that millions of graves would scar the earth, that their sacrifice would reshape the world. The march of the Titans had begun, and the ground shook beneath their feet. The guns began to roar in late summer of 1914, and soon Europe's fields were scarred into wastelands. What had begun with flags, cheers, and the blaring of brass bands quickly sank into a nightmare of mud, blood, and endless thunder. The armies clashed head-on in Belgium and France, and within weeks the dream of a quick war vanished. Lines froze, neither side able to strike the decisive blow, and men began to dig. They dug with shovels, picks, bare hands, anything that could carve a shelter into the soil. By autumn, the land from the Swiss border to the North Sea was carved into a jagged scar of trenches stretching hundreds of miles, a labyrinth of ditches, dugouts, and barbed wire. It was here that men would live, fight, and die for years. A trench was not a shelter, it was a grave waiting for its tenants. Rain filled the channels with muck, rats the size of cats scurried across sleeping men, lice crawled beneath uniforms until the skin blistered. The smell was unbearable, a mix of rotting food, sweat, corpses, and the stinging odor of wet gunpowder. Soldiers crouched ankle-deep in mud, rifles slung across shoulders, helmets pulled low, eyes staring across a barren strip of land called no man's land. That space, sometimes no more than 100 yards wide, was a place of death. Rusting wire curled across it like claws, craters gaped like open mouths, bodies lay twisted and unclaimed. When the whistle blew, men climbed the ladders, rifles in hand, and surged over the top. The first step was the hardest, but after that, the roar of shells and machine guns swallowed everything. They ran through mud that clutched their boots, over ground that swallowed them whole, past comrades falling in heaps. Machine guns swept the field like scythes, mowing down waves of attackers. Shells burst in plumes of smoke and fire, raining shards of steel. Gas drifted low and invisible, creeping into lungs, burning eyes, suffocating throats. Soldiers clawed at masks, screaming in silence as they collapsed, their bodies convulsing in the muck. Verdun, the Somme, Ypres, the names became etched in memory like curses. Verdun in 1916 was a furnace, 9 months of unending bombardment. The French held the line with teeth clenched, their motto, "They shall not pass," whispered like a prayer and screamed like defiance. Shells fell by the millions, reducing forests to splinters, villages to rubble, hills to flat, smoking wastelands. Men lived like shadows, emerging from dugouts only to fire, to carry stretchers, to collapse under exhaustion. They fought not for glory but because retreat was unthinkable, because comradeship bound them tighter than fear. On the Somme, British forces launched the Great Assault. July 1, 1916, the whistles blew, and thousands of men surged forward in ordered lines. Within hours, 60,000 lay dead or wounded, the greatest slaughter in a single day in Britain's history. Commanders watched from distant hills, stunned, as entire regiments vanished into the smoke. Survivors stumbled back, eyes hollow, ears ringing, boots soaked with blood. Yet still the orders came, again and again, until the ground itself seemed to cry out from the weight of the dead. At night, the trenches were alive with ghostly sounds. The groans of wounded left in no man's land drifted across the dark, calling for mothers, for God, for water. Patrols crawled through wire, knives ready, searching for enemy scouts. Flares burst overhead, turning night into a ghastly theater of shadows. Snipers watched for movement, a single silhouette meaning sudden death. And through it all, the rats thrived, feeding on bread, on scraps, on the fallen who could not be buried. Soldiers wrote letters home, trying to hide the horror from families. They spoke of health, of comrades, of courage, but between the lines the truth seeped through. Men barely 20 grew old in weeks, their faces carved by exhaustion, their laughter replaced by silence. They lived for small mercies, a hot cup of tea, a cigarette passed along, a letter from home. They found brotherhood in shared suffering, love in friendship that defied the desolation. When one fell, another carried his rifle, his photograph, his final words. Artillery never stopped. The ground shook day and night, nerves frayed until men twitched at every sound. Some broke, stumbling back from the line in a daze, eyes wide, mouths mumbling nonsense, unable to hear or speak. They were called cowards by some, but others knew the truth, that the mind could only bear so much before it shattered. Shell shock, the doctors said, though the men themselves knew it was the war's curse, invisible but as deadly as any bullet. Gas became the new terror. Yellow clouds of chlorine rolled across the fields, searing lungs, leaving men writhing in agony. Phosgene killed more silently, filling lungs with liquid until men drowned on dry land. Then came mustard gas, blistering skin, burning eyes, leaving men blind and scarred for life. Masks offered some protection, but panic often made them useless. Soldiers fumbled with straps, clawed at filters, tore the rubber in desperation. The fear of gas seeped into every dream, every watch on the line. Life in the trenches was punctuated by sudden offensives and long stretches of waiting. Men played cards in dugouts, sang songs to drown out the guns, carved names into wooden beams. They dreamed of home, of mothers' kitchens, of wives' arms, of fields untouched by war. Some laughed loudly, defiantly, as if daring death to claim them. Others sat in silence, staring at photographs until their eyes blurred. All knew that sooner or later, the whistle would blow again. Winter brought new torments. Snow turned the trenches into frozen coffins, frostbite gnawed at toes and fingers, breath hung in the air like smoke. Men huddled together for warmth, coughing in unison, blankets stiff with ice. Food froze, water froze, hope itself seemed brittle and fragile. Yet orders still came, patrols still went out, shells still fell, and death still walked the frozen earth. The enemy across the wire was both hated and pitied. Sometimes, during brief truces, men exchanged cigarettes, spoke in broken words, shared laughter before returning to kill each other. They were mirrors, faces of the same suffering, trapped in the same machine. But commanders demanded victory, and so the slaughter continued, wave after wave, year after year. By 1917, the trenches had become a world of their own, a vast underground city of misery. Men were born into it when they first stepped over the sandbags, and many died in it, never seeing beyond the horizon. The land was scarred beyond recognition, trees gone, rivers poisoned, villages erased. Only mud, wire, and shell holes remained, testimony to the fury of modern war. Yet within the horror, courage burned. A medic running into fire to drag back the wounded, a soldier throwing himself on barbed wire so comrades could pass, a man refusing to abandon his friend even as shells rained around them. Such acts, small in the vastness of war, shone like stars in the black sky. They did not change the course of the battle, but they preserved humanity amid the inhuman. And always, above it all, the thunder of guns rolled without end. The sky flashed, The earth shook, the trenches groaned under the weight of fire. Men slept with shells as lullabies, awoke with barrages as alarms, lived with death as neighbor. They counted days not in hours but in bombardments, in the number of comrades still alive, in the letters that reached them. The trenches became the true face of the war, not the flags or the speeches, but the mud, the blood, the endless waiting for death. Here, Europe's youth was consumed, generation after generation fed into the maw. Here, the world learned that modern war was not glory but annihilation. And here, in the stench and the silence between shells, men wondered if the world beyond still remembered them, if life would ever return, if peace was more than a dream whispered in the dark. The hell of the trenches was not an episode, it was a lifetime compressed into years, an existence where each dawn might be the last. And still the soldiers endured, because there was no other choice. The year 1917 carried with it the weight of exhaustion, a heaviness that pressed on every army across Europe. Men were worn to the bone, nations bled of youth and treasure, and still the trenches stretched on without end. Yet in this grinding deadlock, cracks began to appear. A storm of change was gathering, a tide shifting beneath the surface of the endless slaughter. The old order trembled, and the war that seemed eternal began to bend toward its climax. The soldiers at the front could feel it before the generals did. Rumors whispered along the trenches like sparks on dry straw, Russia faltering, America preparing, Allies reshaping their strength. Letters from home spoke of hunger in cities, strikes in factories, anger boiling in streets. It was not just the soldiers who were weary, entire nations staggered beneath the burden of war. In Russia, the collapse came like an avalanche. The empire, already strained by defeats and shortages, finally broke in the fires of revolution. Soldiers deserted in droves, throwing down rifles, marching home to seize land. The Tsar was gone, the throne empty, and in the chaos a new government rose and fell, replaced by the Bolsheviks. They promised bread, land, peace, and to many war-shattered peasants and soldiers, that promise was salvation. By the spring of 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, abandoning the fight, handing Germany swathes of territory in exchange for escape. The Eastern Front went silent, but the silence was ominous, freeing German divisions to thunder westward. The generals in Berlin believed victory was within the grasp. With Russia gone, they dreamed of striking a hammer blow before America's armies could fully arrive. They planned massive offensives, storms of steel meant to shatter the Allies before new strength tipped the scales. In the spring of 1918, German troops surged forward, unleashed in a final gamble. The Kaiserschlacht, the Emperor's battle, drove deep into Allied lines. Villages fell, rivers crossed, trenches abandoned. Soldiers who had clung to the same mud for years now found themselves retreating, falling back, fighting for every yard. It was a time of terror and desperation. The German stormtroopers came fast and brutal, slipping through gaps, bypassing strongpoints, sowing chaos behind the lines. Shells fell in cascades, clouds of gas drifted low, the roar of battle rolled without pause. Paris itself seemed within reach, the bells of the city muffled by fear. Civilians packed belongings, governments whispered of flight, commanders wondered if the war would end in defeat after 4 endless years. But the tide had already begun to turn. The Americans arrived in growing numbers, young, fresh, unscarred by years in the trenches. The uniforms were new, their rifles polished, their songs loud. They were mocked at first by weary veterans, called doughboys, but their presence carried a weight of hope. Where one French or British unit had been exhausted, 2 American battalions now stood ready. They fought with courage born of naivety, storming into battles like Belleau Wood and St. Mihiel with a ferocity that shocked even their allies. Their blood was spilled freely, but with each drop came momentum. Meanwhile, the Allies had learned from years of agony. Tanks, once crude and unreliable, now rumbled forward in coordinated thrusts, iron beasts crushing wire and fear. Alike, aircraft filled the skies in swarms, dueling for mastery, bombing trenches, guiding artillery. New tactics replaced old slaughter: creeping barrages, combined arms, precision strikes. The generals who had once thrown men into machine guns now spoke of coordination, movement, speed. The German advance slowed, then faltered, then bled itself dry. Their soldiers were brave, but their bodies were thin, their rations scarce, their spirits hollow. They fought on black bread and turnips, dreaming of home, of warmth, of an end that never came. In the rear, riots erupted, workers striking, sailors mutinying, families starving. The empire that had once thundered with pride was cracking from within. The Allies seized the moment. In the summer and autumn of 1918, they launched the 100 Days Offensive, a relentless tide rolling forward. Day after day, the trenches that had stood for years crumbled. The Hindenburg Line, once declared impenetrable, was pierced and shattered. Villages were liberated, rivers crossed, forests stormed in waves of fire and steel. For the first time in years, the front moved not by yards but by miles. The soldiers who had endured hell felt the shift in their bones. They advanced past the ruins where they had once bled, stepping over craters filled with water and ghosts. They marched through fields scarred with barbed wire, carrying flags that fluttered not in celebration but in grim determination. They knew victory was coming, but they also knew it demanded a final price. Each advance was bought in blood, each mile paid for by brothers who fell. In Germany, the streets seethed. The people could bear no more. The Kaiser's speeches rang hollow, promises turned to ash. In the ports, sailors raised red flags, refusing to sail on a last, suicidal mission. Workers filled the squares, demanding peace, demanding bread, demanding change. The empire cracked open, revolution sweeping through its veins. The Kaiser fled into exile, and a republic was born amid chaos. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. The armistice was signed, the slaughter ended. Soldiers stood in stunned quiet, unable to believe the thunder that had been their heartbeat for years was gone. Some cheered, some wept, some simply stared, hollow-eyed, as if robbed of the only life they had known. The war was over, but the silence was heavier than the guns had ever been. Across the fields of France and Belgium, millions of bodies lay unclaimed, the earth itself a cemetery. Towns were rubble, forests bare stumps, rivers poisoned with blood and steel. An entire generation was gone, swallowed by mud and fire. Those who returned came back changed, haunted by memories that words could not carry. In the halls of Versailles, leaders gathered to dictate peace. They carved maps, signed treaties, made promises, and sowed new seeds of bitterness. Germany was forced to accept blame, to pay reparations, to bow under humiliation. The victors celebrated, but beneath the banners and speeches, shadows lengthened. The war had ended, but peace was fragile, poisoned by anger and resentment. For the soldiers, the end was not triumph but survival. They returned to homes that no longer felt the same, to families who could not understand what they had endured. Nightmares stalked their sleep, silence haunted the days. They had walked through hell and back, and though the world called them heroes, they carried only scars. The Great War had been promised as the war to end all wars. Instead, it left scars that would bleed again. But in 1918, as the guns fell silent, there was only exhaustion, relief, and the quiet mourning of a world that had lost too much. The world after the armistice was a world in ruins, scarred not only in landscapes but in hearts and minds. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month had silenced the guns, but the silence that followed was heavy, almost unbearable, like the weight of a coffin lid closing over Europe itself. Villages that once rang with laughter were now skeletons of stone, their churches toppled, their fields shredded into wastelands of wire and crater. The very soil seemed poisoned, littered with helmets, rifles, bones, and the rusting fragments of an age that had devoured its youth. The soldiers who staggered home were not the same men who had marched away 4 years earlier. The uniforms were torn, their boots cracked, their eyes distant and hollow. They were called heroes, embraced by crowds, kissed by mothers and wives, but inside they carried shadows that no celebration could banish. Some had lost limbs and now limped through the streets with wooden crutches. Others had lost faces, hidden behind masks of tin and leather that made children cry. The lucky ones bore only the scars in their minds, dreams that returned every night, visions of comrades torn apart by shells, the endless scream of artillery echoing even in silence. Families reunited, yet often found strangers at their tables. Wives tried to hold husbands who flinched at every sudden sound. Mothers tried to comfort sons who stared through them as if looking into the abyss. Joy mingled with unease, pride with sorrow. The world had demanded everything, and though the war had ended, its price was still being paid in quiet rooms where men wept alone, in hospitals filled with broken bodies, in graveyards where crosses multiplied like forests. In the great capitals, leaders gathered to shape the new order. Versailles became the stage where pens carved borders and treaties with more cruelty than any sword. Germany, beaten and starved, was forced to kneel. Reparations, disarmament, the acceptance of guilt, all were written into the treaty like shackles. The victors congratulated themselves, calling it justice, but outside the hall ordinary Germans wept with rage, humiliation burning hotter than hunger. The seeds of another storm were being sown, though no one yet could see the full shadow it would cast. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had vanished, broken into fragments, its peoples scattered into new nations with fragile hopes. The Ottoman Empire crumbled, its territories carved apart by foreign hands. Russia, bled by war and revolution, had become something unrecognizable, the red flag of Bolshevism rising over a shattered empire. Across the globe, old orders fell and new powers trembled into being. The war that had been promised as quick, clean, decisive had instead detonated the entire structure of the world. Ordinary people tried to rebuild their lives in this altered landscape. Farmers returned to fields that would not yield, their soil choked with shrapnel and corpses. Children played among ruins, their laughter thin against the silence of missing fathers. Cities staggered under shortages, economies crushed by debt. Widows in black crowded churches, orphans wandered streets with hollow eyes. And yet, slowly, painfully, life resumed. Weddings were celebrated, markets reopened, new songs were sung. Humanity clung to survival, as it always had, but beneath every smile there lingered the shadow of the war that would not be forgotten. For those who had fought, memory was inescapable. In cafes, veterans gathered in silence, smoking in heavy air, their eyes speaking what their mouths could not. Some tried to put their stories into words, writing books, painting canvases, composing music. Others drowned their memories in drink, or in silence, shutting themselves away from a world that no longer made sense. The term shell shock began to enter common speech, a faint attempt to name the nameless torment. No word, no speech, no monument could capture the weight of what had been endured. And yet monuments rose, tall and solemn, in cities and villages across Europe. Statues of soldiers, plaques of names, endless rolls carved into stone. Towns too small to boast a library now raised memorials, for every place had lost its sons. Fields once soaked in blood became cemeteries, row upon row of white crosses stretching beyond sight, the only order left in a world of chaos. Poppies grew in churned soil, red petals nodding in the wind as if remembering. The people called it the Great War, the war to end all wars. They spoke with certainty, swearing that never again would nations allow such horror. Politicians promised peace, poets wrote verses of mourning and resolve, ordinary mothers whispered prayers that their children would never march to such slaughter. But history does not rest so easily. Beneath the mourning, bitterness brewed. The victors believed they had secured the world, the defeated believed they had been betrayed. The scars left on land and soul were too deep, too wide, too raw. And somewhere, in the silence of a German trench abandoned to weeds, a rusting helmet lay half buried. In the hollow of that helmet, rainwater gathered, reflecting the gray sky above. A single bird landed on the wire, singing, its fragile song trembling in the ruined air. It was a small reminder that life endured, even in the aftermath of death, that history would march forward whether men wished it or not. But in the silence, the echo of guns still lingered, faint but unforgotten, like a warning. The Great War had ended, but it had not ended the world's appetite for conflict. It had redrawn the map, shattered empires, toppled kings, and scarred humanity. And in its wake it left both hope and dread, hope that suffering might have taught wisdom, dread that the lesson would be forgotten. The war to end all wars had not ended war. It had only been the first act of a greater tragedy yet to come.